Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you. My name is Deborah Dudak. I'm from the Fountaindale Public Library here in Bolingbrook, Illinois. Thank you so much for attending our Here Come the Doughboys, Tracing Your World War I Military Ancestors webinar and workshop. We're very, very pleased that you all are here joining us both online and in person. So if you have any questions online, please don't forget to send those through our chat. And if you're here in person, we'll be answering questions at the end of the session. So if you'll please hold your questions till then, we really appreciate it. My speaker and guest today is Tina Baird from Tamarack Genealogy. She's going to be kicking off our session, recreating lost World War I records. We promise that this will probably answer a lot of the questions that you'll have about how to get started with World War I genealogy. But before we get started with the program today, we'd like to put out a very special thank you to World War I in America grant. They have made this day possible by providing funds for libraries across the United States to be able to celebrate and to commiserate the centennial of the First World War. So without any further ado, I will pass this on to Tina Baird. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Now that we got to see the first slideshow presentation, what I'm going to talk to you about is how you can recreate your own history for your World War I veterans. So unfortunately, not everything lives in one location. You know, even if you're looking for federal records, there's not a one-stop shopping experience where you can go and collect data on what their military experience was like. A lot of times we have to do that legwork and that digging to try to figure out where all of the different pieces of that puzzle might live and then fit it all together. So what types of records are useful to you in order to put that record together? So newspapers, first and foremost, are going to give you a ton of information about troop movements and about unit histories and about your individual soldier themselves. War histories, which are, the big war histories, things about, the Battle of the Somme or things about the First World War, anything by Martin Gilbert or Barbara Tuchman are going to be brilliant. But then you're going to move down to individual histories, whether it be a soldier's written diary or history, a county history, things like military regiment histories and war diaries like that. Regimental lists that you can find on different levels, whether it's the 88th Division or the 4th Division, or whether it's just a list of the men who were in the 313th Engineers. Those records are going to be useful to you as well. And believe it or not, there are a lot of county courthouse records that you can use to help you figure out, what was their discharge date, what was the name of their unit, what camp were they stationed, and then your actual service record itself for your individual veteran. So where do all of these things live? Like I said, they live in a variety of places. So you're going to start locally. You're going to look at your local historical society and library. You're going to contact them and see what kind of information they have. I'm going to give you some examples of this in a minute. Military service organizations. The number one thing about a military service organization is what do you have to be in order to join? Right? You have to be a veteran or a family member of a veteran. So you would have to supply that data in order to become a member. So that's a good place to start, again, going to your courthouse and looking at their records. Don't overlook archives in universities and museums. And I'm going to talk about some of those a little bit later on. And then your state and your national archives are going to have records that are kept on units, on divisions, on soldiers. And then the individual military bases or camps a lot of times have their own museums or their own archives. So you're going to talk to them as well. So you can see there's a lot of different places that we have to go to in order to make sure that we have all the information that's useful to tell that story. So I always tell people to start locally, no matter what the military engagement is. You always want to start with what you already have. You want to assess the information that already belongs to you or that is accessible to you. So do you have photos of that particular veteran who might be in their service uniform? Because on their uniform, there's going to be clues as well. The band on their cap, the ribbons that they have, the medals that they have on, the stripes that they have on their sleeves. All of those things are going to give you clues as to what type of unit or what branch of service they might have served. So you're going to go through, do you have any letters? Do you have any diaries? Do you have service papers already? How do you know that your veteran served? So you're going to use that information and then slowly start to branch out and move up the food chain. So you're going to contact your local bodies and ask them. A lot of towns have monuments like we do for Plainfield. They have the listing of all of the soldiers who served. But this isn't always complete. In the example of Plainfield, what happened was they decided to erect the monument in 1924 after the war to honor their soldiers. The problem was a lot of these guys had already left town. So when they put the list of names together for the soldiers who served, they were only getting responses back from the people who were still living locally. So sometimes those lists aren't always terribly accurate, because if you have a guy who picks up and moves out of town, he's not going to be represented. So use it as a guideline, use it as a starting point, but don't assume if your soldier's name's not on there that they didn't serve. You're just going to kind of use it as a guidepost to steer you in the right direction. So contact your local library. If you're all sitting here today, or if you're at home watching us streaming live, you're utilizing your local library. So take advantage of the libraries in those communities where the soldier may have lived. And that goes for the course of that soldier's life. So if that soldier enlists in Illinois, and there might be a record of him at the local library as serving in the military, but then they move out of town and they move to Iowa, and they might join the American Legion in Iowa, and then they eventually move out to California, which is where they retire and pass away. You need to be contacting those local bodies in each of those places, whether it's the Historical Society, the local museum, the local library, or the local Veterans Service Organization, because there's going to be little bits and pieces of that record in each of those locations where that soldier lived. So, you can find out information about their service, where they might have enlisted, but if you want to find out what they did after that, what groups they joined, you want to make sure that you're contacting the libraries and the museums in those collections as well. Take advantage of the library collections that we have. Not only do we have those war histories, not only do we have access to digital copies of some military records, but we also create records, homegrown records that we have access to as well. So we might have indexes to our local cemeteries, which are going to label their veterans, and they're going to label that they're First World War veterans. Or we might have records for the local American Legion, or we might have records for other parades or memorials that are going to happen. So we might have records that you're not going to find anywhere else. Like I mentioned, newspapers are really the best place to go. If you're lucky enough to have a newspaper that has digitized those collections and you could do a search, great. I'll come back to that in a minute on how to ferret out more of that information. But they're going to have things like returning soldiers, furloughs, letters home, lists of casualties. So there's going to be a lot that you're going to be able to get out of contacting your library to see if they even have a clippings file too on the First World War. So now, what about your local society? They're going to have things as well, but they're going to have different things than what your library has. Libraries are typically going to have a lot of textual records, so they're going to have a lot of documents. Historical societies and historical museums, genealogical societies, are going to have more things. They're going to have more ephemera. They're going to have things like uniforms. They're going to have things like souvenirs, foot lockers that might have been donated, helmets, pistols, whatever it happens to be. They're going to have those things I mentioned, like dedications, welcome home ceremonies where they're throwing a dinner or hosting a program for those soldiers, photos of parades, things like that. So letters and diaries, too, can be really useful to you. Now, the downside to historical societies is very few of us have the luxury to create records that go down to the surname level. So if somebody is a First World War veteran and they kept a diary, and that diary gets donated to the Historical Society, very few historical societies have the ability to write a full transcript or document all of the surnames or create an index to the people who are listed in that file. So, anytime I go to a museum or to a historical society, I'll ask them, do you have information on the name or the names of the soldiers I'm researching? And if they say no, they don't, then I'll ask them, well, do you have anything on the First World War? Or do you have anything on this unit in which they served? And they might say, yeah, we have a diary from a gentleman. Nobody serves in a vacuum. You're serving with your brothers, your cousins, your neighbors, the milkman, the newsboy down the street. So if somebody in your community writes a diary, it might be very impactful because it might mention your soldier because they all went into the military together, or they're going to be talking about a military engagement or a battle, or just military life in general, that's going to be pertinent to you for your research. So even if it doesn't mention your soldier specifically by name, it's still going to be useful to you in your research because it's going to provide that first-person account of what military life was like. So if they served and they're from the same town, if they were in a unit or a division, the same division, it's still going to be important because, you know, if they were at the San Miquel battle, then your soldier was there, then that's going to be telling the same story. So a lot of times I'll go in and I'll ask, and if they provide these for me, I'll scan through them to see if the details match up with what I know about my veteran. I take advantage of things like oral history projects. A lot of communities do oral histories with their veterans. You know, so to sit down and hear what it was like for the local boys in whatever military engagement it might have been provides a lot of insight and a lot of background for me. So we're not just genealogists. You guys have heard me say this before. We're not just genealogists, we're family historians. Our job is to be able to take our ancestors and put them into the context of their community, the state, the nation, and the world. So using oral histories, using letters, using diaries, you know, provides that background information and gives you a richer understanding of what that experience was like, what that war was like, what that military battle was like. So, you know, you should be using these, you should be reading these histories because it's going to make you understand, you know, how it affected not only your soldier, but how it affected their family when they returned and how their return affected their community as a whole when they returned as well. So take advantage of these kind of resources that they can provide for you. Photos, again, are very obvious. Like I said, you know, we can look at this photo right here of Roy Chapman and kind of get an idea, you know, for the type of service that he might have seen. So take advantage of those as well. When I go into a historical society, I always ask them if I can see their unidentified photos. And they look at me like I've lost my mind. Why would you want to see a box of unidentified photos? Well, if you have unidentified World War I soldiers, or if they have a photo of American Legion picnics or parades, or induction ceremonies for new officers, they might not be named, but you might be able to pick out your soldier out of those photos. So not only is it helping you because now you have a photo of your veteran, but you're helping them by providing names to the people who in their records are listed as unnamed. So always ask, do you have First World War photos that are unidentified? You know, it might actually prove to benefit both of you. I talked about ephemera, I talked about things and the types of things that exist. This is one of my favorite examples. It's a pillow sham that was given to a soldier's wife after he returned home from the First World War, and it's 16 by 16. But look at all of the information that exists in this record. So it tells me that he was stationed at Kelly Field, Texas. It tells me that he was in the 11th Aero Squadron in the First Day Bombardment Group. That's a real unit. It's not a one-day thing. They didn't all disband after the first day of the war. This was the name of the company throughout the course of the war. So it's a photo of the planes that they would fly or that they would maintain, and a photo of all of the soldiers who were in that particular unit. So a pillow sham that you might think is inconsequential led me to exactly where to find this unit's military records because I knew the company, I knew the unit, and I knew the location of their service. So take advantage of stuff like that too. Don't think that it's not important. Here's another example. Ira Jones's footlocker from the Plainfield Historical Society. So after Ira Jones passed away, his family donated it to the society, and inside of it was his uniform, his gas mask, you know, grenades, and every once in a while we'll joke, are we sure those are deactivated? You know, they're not still live, are they? But the biggest find in there was he was the company photographer for his unit. So there were 90 negatives still in the Army-issued sleeve, indexed. Every photo was indexed with who was in the photo. We took these out, and we were able to get these developed and scanned. And we have a very detailed record of that unit's service history from when they were stationed at Camp Dodge until they went overseas to France. You know, so it was a huge find for us. So sometimes looking at the ephemera, looking at the objects, can provide you a lot of information. So like I said, public library collections will have things like cemetery indexes, will have county histories. I'm going to give you some examples of those, some of those unit histories. And a lot of those are digital that we can download for you, like the history of the 4th Division, the history of the 88th Division. We have access to those records. And I had mentioned the importance of newspapers. Now, what I love most about newspapers is, yes, you can use them to find out information about your particular soldier. But what you can also use newspapers for are to give you a feel for what was it like in the community at that time. You know, we have the advantage of hindsight. We know how the war ended, right? They didn't. For them, this was going on in real time. They didn't know how their brothers, how their uncles, how their fathers, you know, how their fiancés or their husbands or sons were were doing in the war. All they could do was rely on the newspaper accounts that were coming into them, and in some of these cases, just once a week. You know, a lot of community newspapers were only published once a week, so you would have to wait to find out what was happening. But what's fun is it kind of tells you what's going on, especially at the start of the war. So when the U.S. declares war in April of 1917, there was a deferment for married men. A whole bunch of men ran out and got married in April of 1917. One of your grandparents could very easily be one of those couples that ran out and got married in April of 1917. A couple weeks after, the U.S. government said, no, we cannot have this. And they decided to cancel the deferment based on marriage eligibility. So all of those men who ran out and got married within that month after the start of the war then had to go back and ask for exemption. And in the newspapers, they would run articles about which men were exempted and which men were not. So I would love to compare, and I haven't had time to do this yet, to compare the spike in April of marriages with a spike of divorces in May. To see how many of those guys who weren't able to claim deferment actually wound up divorcing the young lady that they married the month before. But these are the things that you need to know what's going on within your community. The newspapers would also run the draft number lists. So they would give you a full list of all the boys and their draft number. And then they would say, like in Aurora, there was one that said, if your number is below 350, you are most likely going to war. Right? So imagine you're reading the paper and you're 283. Oh. You know, so these tell a very important story. You know, so if you're not sure if they served, you're kind of sitting on the fence, you can't find any photos that prove it, but, you know, it seems likely, look for these type of articles that you're going to find in the local paper, because they're going to tell you right away. You know, this came out the week that the war was announced in April 6th, you know, and it says David Fairweather, Guy McCauley, Charles Green, Elmer Craig, Oscar Schwenke, all ran out to enlist right away. You know, they didn't wait. They didn't wait to be drafted. They enlisted as soon as they could. They're even listing the boys from out of town who used to live in town who've enlisted already. And they're telling you the boys who were rejected. Ralton-Siller was rejected on account of his eyes. Well, Ralton-Siller petitioned again later on that summer and was accepted and wound up serving in the First World War as well. But at first he was rejected because they could be a little bit more selective in who they were going to accept. So these are great ways to find out. So people will talk about using the World War I draft cards as an example to help you figure out whether or not your soldier served. The problem is you had 75,000 men who enlisted before the first draft. So it's 75,000 men who aren't being represented in that first set of draft cards. You know, so if you're struggling to find these guys who you believe, you know, may have served or may not have served, and you're not finding a draft card, there's a very good reason. Another good reason you might not find a draft card is because they weren't going in and creating records for those who were institutionalized. So if you were in the hospital, if you were in a mental health facility, if you were in prison, they're not documenting you. So those are other people who aren't being represented in those lists that you're finding online. Those records do exist, and the last I was told is that they were still on microfilm at the National Archives, but they are not available on Ancestry or Fold3 or Family Search. So take a look for those. And when I talk about newspapers, the importance of newspapers is the fact that they're widespread. So if you're looking online and you're doing a search for Oscar Schwenke because he's your veteran, and you're not coming up with any records on him, you need to expand your search and look broader. You know, through the other records I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to point out what their company is, what their unit is. Look for those. So it doesn't have to be your paper. Nationally, they're reporting on these divisions, these units, these companies. So if you're striking out locally because your paper's not digitized or you can't get to that community to look at microfilm or at the originals, start looking on a wider scale as well. You know, if they were in the 88th Division or if they were in the 3rd Illinois Division, you can look for that keyword in the newspapers and see it reported on in Oklahoma and in New Jersey and in California. So you don't have to necessarily limit yourself to your local paper. And if they were stationed at a camp, if they were at a camp or a base, then they're going to be reported on as well. So a lot of camps had their own newspapers. A lot of units had their own newspapers. The Camp Dodger for Camp Dodge, the Silver Chevron for Camp Grant. You know, they had their own newspapers. We've heard of Stars and Stripes, right? There was the U.S. edition and there was the French edition. just like in the Second World War, there were three. There was the U.S., there was the Pacific and the European versions of the same newspaper. So looking locally, looking to see if the camp paper still exists, and then looking for reports about that camp in the surrounding communities. So I love this one as an example. So this is out of the Aurora Beacon News, and they're referencing Camp Grant in Rockford. And they're talking about all of the boys who have come down with the flu and the names of the soldiers who have died. So Camp Grant's paper is going to talk about the flu and the deaths that they've had. There were 5 Rockford newspapers. All 5 Rockford newspapers are going to talk about what's going on at the camp. The papers surrounding that community, Elgin, Aurora, St. Charles, are all going to reference Camp Grant. And then these individual towns where they've lost boys or have men serving in those communities, Polo, Carlisle, Illinois, are also reporting on that camp as well. So you see how you have at least 5 different service points where you can get at that type of information. So take advantage of newspapers to see if you can kind of ferret out this information about what was going on in camp. We have a tendency to think that county histories were really only done for the first centennial and that there weren't any that were done into the 20th century. It's absolutely not true. There were plenty of them that were done at that point. There were a lot of county histories that were produced in the mid to late 1920s. And because of that, a lot of them reference military service in the First World War. I like to use the Offermans as an example because I work with an Offerman. But I like to use them as an example because they had 3 boys who all went to war. And in this county history, they tell you what happened to all 3 of them. So they tell you that Albert served with the 2nd Engineers, he was gassed and shell-shocked during the war, and he served in 5 battles. And then his other brother also served in the war. And then you had the last brother who was in officer training school at DePaul, so he never actually saw action, but he was enlisted, and he was getting trained in order to go to the front as well. So these county histories can offer a tremendous amount of information. So don't think that there isn't something that exists because it seems too modern. Take a look and see if you can find them. There's a lot of communities that put out books about their soldiers as well. So this is a multi-part series in Aurora that was put out by the Chicago Herald-Examiner. And there are a lot of communities in the Chicagoland area that have these booklets. I think it's a 6-volume set. And what these have in them is they have the photos of the bigwigs. So they're going to have photos of the mayor and all of the people who serve on the board for Aurora. They're going to have the heads of the Red Cross. They're going to talk about the people who are in charge of the bond drives to raise money for the war. But then they're going to have all kinds of photos of headshots of the boys who are serving from within that community as well. So it's a great resource to find a photo of a veteran with a little snippet, not much, not more than a couple sentences long, about who they are, what unit they're in, and whether or not they've died or whether or not they're currently stationed overseas. So these are great resources to take advantage of as well. And later in the day when I talk about the pandemic, I'll talk about another series of records that you can find too. But a lot of counties would put out what were called Gold Star books. Have any of you heard of this term? It's books, it's histories about the boys who were killed or the nurses who were killed during the war. So a lot of communities like Sangamon County, Bureau County have these Gold Star books that are just outside of copyright, so you can find them digitally online, that are going to provide the same kind of information about the war. So you have several resources there to take advantage of. And believe it or not, the Library of Congress is a public library. So take advantage of what the Library of Congress has as well. So not only do they have books that we can borrow through interlibrary loan, just come to your local librarian and see if we can request them. A lot of them are available. But they have thousands of downloadable images that you have access to, from the panoramics of the camps to the individual photos of soldiers and battles and engagements. You have access to the Veterans Oral History Project through Library of Congress as well. The last time I checked, there were 75 First World War oral histories that you would have access to through Library of Congress. Like I said, if you go in person, so if you go to DC and you utilize these records, you have access to the camp newspapers as well. And I provide over here just a small screenshot of all of the camp papers that they have. So you can see they have them for overseas. You can see that they have them across the country, from Virginia to California to Washington, D.C. to Illinois. So there are lots of camp newspapers that exist. Take advantage of those as well. And then they've put together a really nice collection right here for the anniversary of the war where they've kind of curated important documents and photos and volumes from the First World War that they've put together in a nice, easily searchable collection for you. So now, veterans service organizations, which I mentioned. The American Legion comes from the First World War. You know, it's a direct relation to the boys who came home from France, founded the American Legion in those first couple of months after the start of 1919. So the American Legion records are going to be founded by men who served in the First World War. So if you can contact the American Legion, and there might be more than one in your community, ask them if they have copies of their charter, which is going to list the names of the men who started the organization, or if they have a list of their members. Did they keep copies of their member rosters, their application cards? A lot of communities did. But the American Legion also put out a magazine. And at first it used to be weekly. The first couple of months after the war, they would publish it weekly, and then it went to be once a month, and it's still published today. There's a full run of the American Legion magazine that's digitized online through Internet Archives. I apologize. So the important thing is, at the end of the war, there were a lot of guys who were searching for their buddies, the other men who were in their units. They might have been wounded, so they weren't discharged with their unit when they came home. So there's letters at the end of these weekly magazines. Hey, I served in, the 113th Corps. I'm looking for my buddies from Company A. And it gives their name and their address, right? So it's providing information potentially about your soldier. But like I said, we're historians. So what's important in those first few months after the end of the war is that they're writing letters, they're writing articles, trying to help men reacclimate themselves to civilian life. So there's a lot of articles there like, how do I collect, my bonus? How do I collect any payments that I received while I was overseas? How can I file for insurance benefits? And how do I take advantage of schooling opportunities? So there's a lot of information there. So while we talk about PTSD in the 21st century, in the 20th century, these men returning home from the First World War, who had been in the trenches, who had seen what the flu had done to their units and their divisions, who truly had, health issues, both mental health and physical health issues. They were trying to help them reacclimate back into civilian life. So those first few months of the American Legion magazine are actually really interesting to read, to kind of give you an idea of how hard it was for these men to come back and go right back into society. So it's worth it to take a look at these. They're digitized. You could download the PDFs that you're interested in. The American Legion is just one organization. You have the VFW as well. The VFW is older than the American Legion. It starts in 1904. Ask your Legion, do they have their application cards? Remember what I said, if the soldier moves from one location to another, and there's not a VFW in the new community, but there's an American Legion community, contact both and see if they had joined in the other organization. It doesn't matter if it's 1919 or whether it's 1949. See if they still have these application cards. The VFW magazine does exist, but it's only online back to 2009, so you can only see the recent issues. You can't see the historic issues, but they do exist in a variety of local colleges and universities. Here's an example of one of those records. So this record is for Maynard Kinder. He served in the 2nd Division, the 4th Brigade, and he was a Marine. Says that he served overseas in France and in Germany. Here are his dates of military service. He served from August 28th to December 12th, and then he served again from December 13th to July 4th, and then from July 5th to July 25th. And it tells me the battles in which he was a member, and it gives me a lot of information. I can now take all of this information, because I have his dates, I have his unit, I have his division, I know that he's in the Marines. I can then take those now to the National Archives to try to find his service record. Or I can contact the state to see if he filed for a bonus. So once I have that information, I can start looking for information on that particular division and that particular brigade, find out what it was like to be in the Marines for this particular soldier overseas in France, and get a richer detail of what his service was like. So now what about your courthouse? They're going to have things too. Sometimes they'll have the records of the enlistments. They're going to have the records of the discharges. If there's a bonus paid, the state was late to the game in Illinois. The state didn't start offering bonuses until 1925. Some states did it as early as 1923. There were some counties in some cities that did a bonus automatically when you came home to kind of pay them for their service as a thank you to the community. See if those records exist at your local courthouse. So in Illinois, most of these live in the Recorder of Deeds office, and they would go into the general indexes just like any other transaction that was coming in that day. So we're all standing in the County Recorder of Deeds office, and 5 of us are being discharged from the military. 2 people are filing deeds for a property they just purchased. Somebody's filing a letter of incorporation for a new business or a new church. And we're all just standing in line, and it's being recorded that way chronologically as we're registering. So the state of Illinois, because we love them, has military records sealed to anybody except for the soldier who filed the discharge paper. So it becomes very difficult for us to get our hands on those county records because we're not the next, we're not the person who filed them. We're the son or the daughter or the grandchildren or the nieces. So they cannot seal the index from us. Because those indexes have every type of document, from deeds to discharges, they can't keep us from those. So you can still go and look at the indexes, even if the county won't provide you the discharge paper. They'll send you to the VA, and you'll have to provide written documentation in order to have that information provided to you. I experienced this firsthand with a 90-year-old woman who was trying to get her dad's discharge papers. It took us 8 months to get a copy of it. It was in the index. We had the book in the volume. The county wouldn't give it to us because she wasn't the soldier who filed the record. I'm not going to mention county names here, but you guys can probably guess my favorite county. But that information is still available in a different way. You just got to come around at it from a different avenue, which would be by going through the indexes. If they were disabled or if they left a widow or orphans, sometimes the county, either the assessor of the poor or the county tax assessor or the township assessor would offer payments until that family was able to get back up on their feet again. So sometimes you can find records in the pauper's records or the overseer or the poor's records as well. Here's a copy of one of those index pages. So it gives me the names of the soldiers. There's my Angus, who you've all heard me lament. So it gives the name of the soldiers, the date that they're filing the instrument, meaning the discharge or deed or whatever it happens to be. Tells me that they're all honorably discharged from the U.S. Army or Navy, and gives me the date that it's filed. Off to the side right here, it gives you the book and the page. If any of you are doing research in Kane County, see me when I am not being recorded on air, and I'll tell you how to get access to these. If you're doing research in Will County, see me, I'll tell you how to get access to these. And then here's what the actual document looks like. So there's a ton of information that comes off of these discharge papers. I'm telling you, everything you could want to know, from the location and the date of birth, to their height, their weight, their hair color, tells me, their date of enlistment, gives me the service, the organization in which they belonged, tells me he's 5 feet 10 3/4 inches tall, tells me what his experience was during the service, tells me that he was gassed on the 4th of July in 1918, right, and gives me the name of the military unit in which he is being discharged, how much pay he was entitled to, and who the officer was that discharged him from the Army. So here's a larger copy of that. So there's a ton of information. If you have veterans who served in any other state other than Illinois, take advantage of these, because there is a colossal amount of information that can be provided to you. And then you can take this and then roll it into moving up the food chain to the state level, to the federal level. So the state library, whether it's the Illinois State Library, Michigan State Library, Oklahoma State Library, they're going to have books and publications as well on their soldiers during the First World War. Some of them might be digitized. You'll have to contact the library to find out. But like in Illinois, for the Illinois State Library, they have their own database that you can access. And they'll have things like the history of the 33rd Division, which is a 3-volume set that you have access to download. So there's a lot of information there. The Adjutant General's office oversees all military units within that particular state, whether it's the Adjutant General's office in Massachusetts or in Illinois or in Nebraska. they're the ones that are going to be responsible for military units from that particular state. So they're going to have their own sets of records that are going to be separate from the types of records that the federal government has. So their job is to make sure that troops are being supplied. They're the ones that are taking care of all of the administrative paperwork. So if a unit is dissolved and they're merged with another unit, or if somebody is promoted or they're transferred, or if they go on furlough, or if they're discharged, the Adjutant General is responsible for all of that paperwork. So they're the ones that are keeping records of what's going on during the First World War. Now in Illinois, those records are turned over to the state archives up to World War I. World War I to the present are still owned by the Adjutant General's office in Illinois through the National Guard's office, which is in Springfield. Now, they will tell you there are very few records that survive for Illinois because there was a fire at the Adjutant General's office in 1934 that destroyed the vast majority of records for Illinois servicemen. Illinois just strives to achieve. So the vast majority of these, only about 25% exist, because 75% of them were destroyed in the fire. So it's worth it to contact the Adjutant General's office to see what still exists, like I said, in any other state that you're doing research besides just Illinois. But what Illinois has and what all the states have is they're going to have the federalization numbers for those units that were called up. So if in Illinois you are a part of one unit and then they federalized that unit, they would give it a new number when it joined the federal body. So when it joined the U.S. Army, it would get a new number. And the state put together a nice little list on this. So here's what it looked like. So here's the date that the units were called up for the state of Illinois. Tells me what their new name and division is. So if you were in the Illinois Band, right, you became the 305th Cavalry Band. And these are the dates that they were discharged, that they were demobilized. So if you know you've got paperwork at home that says that Uncle Bob was in the 7th Infantry, they remain the same. But if they happen to have been the 1st Engineers, they became the 108th Engineers. And you need to have that information because that tells you you're going to be looking for two different types of units. In the newspaper, you're going to look for both. On the state level, you're going to look for this one, and on the federal level, you're going to look for this one. Does that make sense? So the state of Illinois has other records as well. They have, like you saw, they have the information about the old soldiers and sailors' homes. Those go up into the 1930s. So if you had a World War I vet who was wounded and came home and needed to be in the hospital, whether it was for physical trouble or tuberculosis or breathing trouble, there were lots of men who came back and died of tuberculosis from being in the trenches. If they had gone into like the Danville Hospital or one of the state hospitals, those records are accessible to you as well through the state archives. And then I mentioned those bonus records. So the fire destroyed, nearly 80% of these records. What remained intact were the applications, the index. So you can go and see if a family member might have applied for the record in the index, which survived intact. But only about 1 in 4 of these records actually survived the fire. So Charles Green, who we saw as one of the first boys to enlist, his mother actually petitioned for his benefit because he died of tuberculosis shortly after the war. And it gives me that he was in Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. It tells me he was in the Army, that she filed from Illinois. Elmer Craig, who was also one of those first 5 boys to enlist, gives me his home address in Joliet, that he served for 890 days, that his bonus payment was $300. When you look at these numbers right here, they do not correspond to their U.S. Army service records. Those are the numbers that were given to them by the state as they were applying for their application. So don't take that number and use it in order to find their federal record. They're not the same types of numbers. Here's an example of the records that did survive the fire. You can see that they are not in the best condition, that I have some that are just little discs. You can't even read the soldier's name on them because they tried to cut all the burnt pieces off. This one's for Clay McCauley, who also was one of those first sets of boys who enlisted. He died of tuberculosis also. He went to Phoenix for his health and wound up dying in Arizona. So in order for his dad to claim his pension, he had to give a certified copy of his death certificate, which appears in his file. Vernie Foots also died. He died at Camp Logan of the flu during the First World War. His dad applied for his bonus as well. So you were paid out on the number of days you served. If you died in the military, you were given a flat rate. Whether you died 4 days in, or 4 months in, or 20 months in, You were paid the same amount if you died in the service. That amount just varied if you happened to have served based on the number of days if you came home. So now if we move up a little further and we move up into National Archives records, so the sad things with National Archives records is the fact that it doesn't all live in one location. So if any of you have had to use National Archives records, you know that they live in a variety of different places across the country. So they have several regional campuses, which would represent records from the surrounding 7 to 10 states. So for Illinois, those records are actually here in Chicago on the south side on Pulaski, and those include records for Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. So things like records for Great Lakes, records for Fort Sheridan, those are the kinds of things that we're going to find here. But I'll talk about those in a minute. They're not the personnel files. They're not the unit files. They're the base maintenance, how to run, how to keep the camp going. They're those kind of records. If you have a veteran who you are next of kin, meaning it's your dad or it's your brother or it's your mother or your son, you can apply online to get access to these records from the federal government. You can click on that link. Very few of us are still next of kin for First World War veterans. So we would have to go through a different process to get access to these. We wouldn't be able to do it online. So when you go to the National Archives website, there are two important buttons here, your Veteran Service Records and your Research Our Records button. So the Veteran Service Records, that's the one that's going to let you apply online if you happen to have, if you're next of kin to a soldier who's served. If you're not, then you're going to want to click on this Research Our Records tab and go through the process of doing your search. When you click on that tab, down here at the bottom, there's a button for military historians, which can provide you some information on the units, on the military engagement, on the structure of the Army or the Navy and how things worked. So it provides kind of that background information that tells a deeper, richer story. You can also use the online catalog and you can search. You could search specifically for the unit, you could search specifically for the soldier. So there's a lot of ways to dig into to find out if records even exist for the unit or the soldier in which you're researching. So the National Archives has what's called Archives 1, which is in Washington, D.C. That's where the Declaration of Independence is, that's where the Constitution is, that's where school children go when they're on their field trips in 8th grade. But what those records are that are housed in that particular building are the stateside records. So that's Record Group 393, and what that record group entails are records related to all military camps and bases within the United States. Record 393 is records like engineering corps records, quartermaster records. They're referred to as the Army of the Continental Command. That's the stateside records. And they're going to include whether it's Civil War, whether it's, World War I, whether it's Korea. If you're stateside, those records are going to live in this record group. So you can limit it down by base and you can limit it down by time periods. You could ask for just the records for the First World War. And what they include in them, which you're going to hear about later, are the alien registrations and naturalizations. They also have things like special orders and burial orders. Special orders sound like they're important and fancy, but they're really not. It's really just the chronological documentation of what was going on in the camp at that time every day. They would put out an order telling you what's going on. And the burial orders can be interesting too. So if you had somebody like Vernie Foots who dies of the flu at Camp Logan, his body needs to be brought back to Illinois for burial. So there's a burial order in there. Who's the person that's going to accompany the body back to Illinois? Who's going to be responsible for turning it over to the family? They're very short. There's not a lot of detail to those, but at least it confirms whether or not somebody died and where they died. I'll talk more about St. Louis records, about burial case files. Those are different from the burial orders. So here's some examples. There's just one little screenshot here. This is a listing of all of the soldiers who were alien soldiers during the First World War in this particular unit. So basically what happened was the draft went on and you were drafted whether you were a U.S. citizen or not. So when they found out that the government was going to offer naturalizations to anybody who serves in the military, they told the U.S. camps to put together a list of all of the men in your unit that are not U.S. citizens. And then they had the right, they would go and they would ask them, would you like to become a U.S. citizen? And if you said no, then there would be a deposition as to why. Well, my brother's in the German army. I don't want to take arms up against him. Or I want to go back to Germany, or I want to go back to Greece or Italy after the war. I don't want to serve. Almost every single one of those men who said no were discharged, honorably discharged from the U.S. government, because they were a threat. They were deemed a risk to keep in the army. And then here's the telegram that gives the orders about how to start collecting these lists of names. You'll hear more about that from Deb in a little bit. Those special orders that I talked about, this one is for Camp Dodge. What it's listing are all the men who are disqualified for overseas duty. And that could be for any number of reasons. You have bad eyesight, you walk with a limp, you have flat feet, you're colorblind. It could be any number of reasons why you're perfectly qualified to be in the Army. They just don't want to send you overseas to the front because you have a disability, a minor disability of some kind. So they list all of the men who can't go overseas, and then their reassignments. So if they were in Company 17 and they're moving them now to a new unit, they're just giving you those. So you can see there's nothing really special order about it. It's just telling you what's going on within the camp at any given time. And these are all just in file after file. So if you know you had somebody who was shipped overseas in July of 1918, you could just go right to the orders for July of 1918 and see if you can find him listed in the special orders as being assigned. So now the National Records Personnel Center, you guys are going to hear an entire hour about the National Records Personnel Center later on today. But I want to point out a couple things if not everybody's going to watch this, especially for those who are streaming it live. So the National Records Personnel Center is open to the public. Any of us can make an appointment and go down and take a look at records. The records are on a rolling schedule of 62 years. So if you have a serviceman or servicewoman in your family who served and were discharged from the U.S. government, Army, Navy, Marines, whatever it happens to be, the cutoff date for those records would be today in 1955. So if they were in the Korean War and they were discharged September 22nd, 1955, they're now accessible to the public and you can go down and view these records. You do not have to be next of kin. You can go down and view these records because they are considered archival. They are no longer private. The downside to this is the fact that there was a National Archives fire in 1973 that destroyed up to 75% of Army and Army Air Corps records up until the 1960s. And I'll talk about this later. But you see how if you have Illinois veterans, how the National Archives fire and then the state archives, the state adjutant general's fire really puts us in a bad research space. So you run the potential when you request these records that they'll come back to you and tell you that they were fire records and that they're not accessible to you. If you make an appointment to go down, make it worth your while. Make sure that you're taking as many names as you can. You have to contact them in advance. You give them the list of soldiers, sailors, nurses that you're looking for. They're going to pull those records. They will not give you a date to come down until they've found all the records. So if you send them a list and you tell them, well, I'm going to come down October 1st, they will tell you when those records are available to you and then give you the dates. You could choose a date to come down. They won't tell you they're available until they've pulled them all. You can bring your own equipment. So you can bring your own flatbed scanner. You can bring your own photography equipment. You can use your iPhone, whatever you want. If you choose that you want to have copies made on their copiers, then they're going to charge you the fee. But these types of records, these are the official government military records. And what they're most well known for are what are called OMPFs, which is the Official Military Personnel File. So that's not about the unit, that's not about the company, that's not about the base, that's about the individual soldier. What was their experience like? And I'll give you more information on that later. If it's a fire record, they could come back and say, well, we only have 3 pieces of information for you. The first is going to be the card file verifying they were in the service. So it's just going to be an index card with the soldier's name and their serial number. The second piece of paper is going to be their final payment voucher. And then the third potential piece of paper would be whether or not they had been hospitalized for any reason. The hospitalization record doesn't go into detail, it just gives you a category. So it could say something like lung difficulties, which could be bronchitis, it could be the flu, it could be pneumonia, it could be a number of things. They're just giving you categories of what the illness was. The final payment roll can be very, very deceiving. And I want you to be aware of this, because at the end of the war, camps were trying to discharge men as fast as humanly possible, especially places like Camp Grant, where you're getting in 10,000 men at a time that they're trying to funnel out as soon as they're coming in, so they're not overcrowded. So for Camp Grant, it tells me that the discharge date for Camp Grant is February of 1919, and it tells me that his unit was the 8th Company, 161st Detached Brigade. If I didn't know any better, I would think that that was the unit in which he served throughout the course of the war. And at first, you don't know. So you have to assume that that's their unit. Through months of research, it turns out that that was just the discharge unit. 1,000 guys at a time. These 1,000 guys go in this unit, they're being discharged. The next 1,000 guys go in another unit, they're being discharged. So the number that's going on their final payment roll could very possibly just be that unit that they're in for 3 days until they're taken out of the service. So sometimes there's a little more investigating that needs to be done. Turns out through another resource, I was able to figure out that his discharge actually, that is just a discharge unit, that he actually served in the 45th CAC, which I found in another set of documents. So, take that information, use it, but if it's not panning out to make any sense, then start looking for other types of documents. If you had a family member who did actually go overseas and they served in France, those records are called the American Expeditionary Forces. Those are for men who served specifically overseas. So if you had a soldier who was here at Camp Dodge and then went overseas to Europe, 2 sets of records. Record Group 393 for their stateside service, and then 120 for their service overseas in France or in Germany. If you're not sure whether or not you have a soldier who went overseas, this is really the best resource to help prove that. So when Deb and I went to DC, I specifically went to access this record group, and they said, oh, no, they're not available, they're being digitized. Okay, fine, I'll be patient. And we said, well, when are they going to be available? And they said, sometime next spring. So we had to wait 6 months before these records actually went live online through Ancestry.com. But what these transportation lists include are the ship's manifests for the boys as they're boarding to go to France, and then the ship's manifests as they're boarding to come back to the US. You have to look at both. And the reason why you have to look at both is because the unit that they go out to France with might not be the unit that they're coming home to the States as a member of as well. So you have to look at both. I have one guy who served from Oswego who went out in the machine gun battalion and then came back in a completely different unit. So you want to make sure that you're getting that full service history by looking at both sets of documents. If you see somebody listed as being a member of a casual unit means that they've been wounded and they're not returning with their regular unit. They're being discharged and returned with other members who were in the hospital with them at the same time. So the guys who show up in the casual unit 11 are the guys most likely from the same hospital ward that are all being discharged and sent home. They could have been from 8 or 10 or 12 different units, but they're being discharged together. So if you see casual listed, that's most likely because they were in the hospital when the war ended. Casualty reports and cablegrams, nursing and hospital records, soldier qualification cards, these are all very large record groups that they have at the National Archives for you to utilize. Casualty reports and cablegrams are a fascinating set of documents, but they are a hot mess. There is no order to them. They are not indexed by surname. They are not indexed by unit. They are done by the date that the order is received. So if you're wounded on September 8th, but it's not reported until September 11th, then you have to find that cablegram that would have been done at that time period. They're very difficult to utilize and they're very difficult to read. This is one page out of what's about a 37-page casualty report. It gives you the name of the soldier, and it gives you a service number. Sometimes you're lucky enough to get the company and the unit that they're in, but not always. So I have Carter King, that's a service number. James Cash, that's a service number. Walter Carter, that's a service number. This is one page. Look at all of those names, right? This is from September. So these are men killed in action during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And then, at the end of it, they would have subparagraph after subparagraph after subparagraph of additional information. We originally reported this guy missing in action. No, he's dead. Or, this particular person had an insurance policy and it's left in the name of his wife, Idina, or his mother, and gives her address back home. But there's no order to these. So if you have a person who's wounded or killed or comes down with disease or some other ailment, they're categorized. So you could see those wounded, you could see those killed, you can see those hospitalized for influenza. There's page after page of influenza victims. And then if you're lucky enough that they reference the next of kin back home, you have access to that information as well. When I talk about flu victims at the end of the day, I'm going to show you how you might get lucky enough to figure out what casualty cablegram they're in based on their index card file, and I'll come back to those. So you've got your soldier qualification cards. I think somebody's working on digitizing these. So this one's for William Vance, gives me his service number, tells me his height, tells me his weight, tells me where he's from, what his occupation is, and then on the back side it tells me what he's good at. He's assigned to the medical department. He's sent to a camp hospital. That's where he is until he's discharged in 1920. Tells me he has up to 6th grade of education, and that he can speak Swedish. His brother also served. His brother Walter also served. He went through 8th grade and could not speak Swedish. The younger one can, the older one can't. So they just kind of verify service, and they're interesting to know whether or not they were given an assignment, and then look for those records from there. So the National Archives in College Park also has extensive photograph collections and extensive map collections. Deb had the pleasure of going through the map collections. I just kind of looked at a couple of them that were pertinent to my Angus when he was wounded in France. But they have just thousands and thousands of photos. So they're starting to digitize these photo collections. The record groups that they fall under are 111 and 165. So you can go into the National Archives catalog online and look for somebody's digitized images already. But if you go there in person, they're already scanned and you can download as many of them as you want. Because the National Archives and the Library of Congress are public bodies, these records are available to us outside of copyright. So all we have to do is document that they came from the National Archives. We don't have to provide copyright. We don't have to ask them for permission because they're already open to the public and accessible. You just need to cite your source like any good genealogist would. Here's an example of some of their maps. So you've got a lot of geographic maps. You've got a lot of, Deb was looking at hospital maps, and my Angus was wounded in southern France, so I was looking for, the region that he might have been with any base hospitals that might have been nearby, so I could go and pull those base hospital records to try to find him listed as being injured among that hospital. But they just have a lot of maps that they've digitized, a lot of maps that are accessible to look at in person as well. And then in their photograph collections, they're all labeled. So this one happens to be for the Signal Corps. Not only does it give me the name of the unit, but it gives me the name of each and every one of the men in that particular photo. So you might easily be able to find a photo of the unit or the division or the company that your soldier served, along with a full list, a full roster of names to go along with it. I mentioned that we have the Great Lakes Military Base records here at the National Archives on Pulaski, but all of those are the things about running the camp. So it's the guardhouse records, everybody who comes and goes. So if you had a soldier who came through there and was on furlough for the weekend to go home and see his family, then you might catch him in the guardhouse records coming and going, or visitors that were coming to visit for the weekend. They would have records about what's going on at the camp, the water temperature, the air temperature, airspeed, things like that. So those records are here in Chicago if you fall into one of those Midwestern states that are represented here. If you want to know more about those records that they have in Illinois, pardon me, you can click on that link for more information. You can also follow them online. You can follow their Facebook page. They have a very good Facebook page, and it's worth it to find out. They'll highlight certain things out of their collections from time to time. I'm still waiting for them to do something on the First World War. Excuse me. So now, what about archives? What about museums? We have some outstanding museums and archives available to us here in Illinois. You have Cantini, which is the 1st Division Museum. They just reopened last month with a new exhibit for the First World War. You have the Pritzker Military Library and Museum. They have a First World War exhibit that's going to go live the weekend of December 13th, so please come down and take a look at that. Things like the Joliet Area History Museum, which has a giant poster of Gold Star servicemen, all the men who were killed from Will County during the First World War. They've got a big poster with all of their photos on it. You know, they have documentation that was donated from families' uniforms, things like that. Have any of you gone to the World War I Museum in Kansas City? It is truly a very moving experience. It's an incredible place. The first time you walk in, you walk over this glass bridge, and underneath it are like 10,000 poppies that are supposed to represent all of the U.S. servicemen who served during the First World War. You know, we had over 4 million men who served, you know, and there was a lot of men, 100,000 men, I think, were either killed or wounded who were listed as casualties during that time. So that's a lot of soldiers who came back with the scars of war. But they have an amazing museum and amazing archives, and they want you to contact them. They want you to go, you know, to their library page, to their archives page. They want you to look at the diaries and the books that they've digitized. They want you to ask them questions. If you find something in their collection that's not digitized yet, they would be happy to get it scanned and sent to you. They really want this information to be out there. So take advantage of, you know, their generosity and go through their collections and see if they have something on the unit or the camp or the soldier that you're looking for. This is the Cantini Museum in Wheaton. You know, in their little research library, they had one of those Gold Star books that I referenced earlier. This one was for the 4th Division. I was looking for John Swackhammer, who was killed in September at the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And in the book, it had a photo of the temporary cemetery where they were buried until they could move them to the American cemetery down the road. So some interesting pieces in there besides just information about the battles themselves. First World War Museum in Kansas City has a lot of newspapers. Camp Dodger was one of them. I mentioned how important these newspapers were. What's also cool about these newspapers is a lot of times they reported on what was going on back home. There was like a back home column, and it would mention things like, oh, so-and-so's wife just had a baby girl, or, you know, their sister just became valedictorian of her class. Like, you know, they want to know what's going on at home just as much as back home wants to know what's going on there. So there's a lot of articles that reference family back home as well. And then collections online that you can utilize. Ancestry has a collection. Fold 3 has a couple of things. I won't get on my soapbox about Fold 3 because we're being filmed. But Internet Archive, if you haven't used Internet Archive yet for your genealogy research, you really should be. But they have thousands upon thousands of First World War books that have been digitized because they're outside of copyright. They're older than 1923, so they're accessible to the public at no charge. You can find a lot of those county histories. You can find a lot of those Gold Star books that are already scanned in color online, available for you to download at any time. And then a couple more pages of websites for you. American Battle Monuments Commission keeps an index of the soldiers who are killed and interred overseas. Most of them have headstone photos. At the very least, they're giving you the plot and the grave location. Europeana is a site that I use. It's Web 2.0, so it's all user-generated. So it's people like us who are uploading information about our soldiers. Most of it is European, meaning French and German, but there are a lot of U.S. families who have submitted information about their soldiers. And then Prisoners of War, Flanders Field Museum projects are just how they sound. They're going to be about people who were captured. This might be a good resource for you if you have a prisoner of war. Veterans Oral History Project I mentioned. Anybody have anybody who was part of the polar bear expedition? Have you heard of that? Those are the U.S. soldiers who were trapped in Siberia, who went to try to protect and find the Tsar. When the war ended, the government just kind of left them there, you know, when they were surrounded. So believe it or not, there's a very large collection of these records at the University of Michigan. So thank you, University of Michigan, for collecting these records about the polar bear expedition. But then keep in mind, too, that we don't serve in a vacuum. So looking at diaries and collections for UK units, Australian units, French units could be important, too. Because when the first U.S. troops got overseas in July, they had to be trained. They had to be trained by people who were experienced in trench warfare. So they were being assigned to largely Australian units and UK units to kind of get that training in order to be ready to start fighting the war. So they're referenced in a lot of these Australian, Canadian, and British unit records because they were stationed with them for a period of time while they were being trained. So take advantage of what other countries are reporting on about U.S. soldiers, especially for nurses. Because when U.S. nurses went over early in the war, they were stationed in British hospitals. So they're going to show up in British hospital records and in British Army records because the U.S. didn't have a hospital yet. These nurses were fully, immersed in British hospitals and British units. So we'll be happy to answer questions. Oh, I'm sorry I ran over by a couple of minutes. But we'll take our break.
Well, actually, because we can answer questions.
Okay.
So does anybody in the room have questions for our first speaker?
Yes?
Well, I just had a question about the qualification cards, why they were created.
Because you needed to know who was a good shot or who was good with horses, because we still had a cavalry. So on a lot of records, like when I'm looking at after action reports, there's a category for horses in cavalry. You guys have heard the story about the Polish cavalry units during the First World War, that served. They were very famous, so they would want to know what your skills were. So the qualification card was to know what could you do. Were you a good typist? Were you a good shot?
When was it created? When you were
Yeah, while you were being evaluated at the camp.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said just a minute ago about when they got overseas in July.
Yeah.
So that was the first?
Yes, the first wave of U.S. soldiers went over in July of 1918. There were some who had been there earlier, but as an official, declaration of war, we've gone over. There were some that went over as early as July of 1917. But the big push of soldiers wasn't until the following year. And then you can find some of those records, like in Illinois, there was an African-American regiment from Illinois who went over, and everybody talks about the Harlem unit, being the most famous and getting the most attention. But the Illinois unit, when it was sent overseas, was actually given to a French unit, and they spent their entire service under a French commander during the war. So those records, if I'm going to look for history of that unit, I'm going to be looking through French records for reference. They had French guns, they had French helmets. Like that's who they were assigned to. Yeah.
At what point were the soldiers asked if they wanted to be a citizen?
They did it in that July, on that you see the date on there, from July to August. That's when they asked, as people, 1918. Oh, what year did they ask them if they wanted to be naturalized citizens? Was it July of 18 or 17?
It was 17.
17, July of 1917.
And then did they start the process, or was that they did?
We'll get into that.
Yeah, Deb's going to talk about that next. So it was shortened. In the U.S., it would typically be 7 years, and it was shortened for those people who had already served. So it was an abbreviated process. Yeah?
I have a question on, once you find a registration card, a World War I registration card, I'll find a card and then I know they served, but I don't see whether they enlisted or whether they were actually conscripted in. Is there a way to tell?
She's asking whether or not there's a way to tell if they were enlisted or if they enlisted themselves or if they were drafted. I've never examined it to look for a difference. There might be on the card, but I haven't looked into it. So I don't want to make an assumption because I haven't pulled that out of the data that I've been looking for. I've just gone by what was listed in the newspaper about the boys who were enlisted and then compared it to the draft numbers that were listed in the newspaper for the community and just compared them that way. So I don't know if there's an official line that they would check enlisted or drafted on. Sorry.
Anybody else?
Yeah?
I would like a little bit more information on the timelines. For instance, I think it was June of 1918, when U.S. soldiers first started going over to Europe, or something like that.
They had sent some before that. There were some who were going over that were more specialized units. So she's asking what date did the timeline for when they started sending soldiers overseas. So they were sending soldiers over as early as July of 1917. But the big push to get soldiers overseas, when we're talking the 4 million U.S. troops, That was really in July and August of 1918. But they were sending soldiers over on a steady stream before that, just not in those kind of numbers. And nurses went over earlier than that.
Any other questions? Okay, well, we'll call it a break and we'll be back. So give Tina a very warm round of applause.